Thank you, Adam, and thanks again for joining us today. Excited to dive into today's topic, building a modern intelligence-led SOC. And our goal for today is to give you a bit of an insight on an approach that we at Red Canary have really been hardening over the last 10 years that we think is optimized for dealing with the current threat landscape. By way of introduction, my name is Aaron Landgraf. I'm the VP of marketing here, product marketing here at Red Canary. Prior to Red Canary, I spent almost a decade at MuleSoft through IPO and acquisition of Salesforce, or by Salesforce. So excited to take some of my learnings from really helping CIOs become really a strategic partner to their business stakeholders and translate some of that to the same type of trends I see emerging for CISOs and security teams today. And I'm joined by Keith McCammon, CSO and co-founder of Red Canary, and I'll let Keith provide a bit more context on himself.
Hey, howdy y'all. Keith McCammon, pleasure to meet you all. By way of background, I've one of the co-founders here, obviously, so I've been here since the bloody beginning. Prior to Red Canary, my background was mostly in offensive information operations and incident response. So security operations in general is very near and dear to me, and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. Let's dig into it. So the problem we're here talking about today, it's not going to be a new problem for anybody listening to this call. Just wanted to put it in a bit of context that helps us understand the urgency behind the need to think a little bit differently about how we approach security operations today, right? So when we are talking to customers, they frequently tell us that their capacity, their cybersecurity team's capacity, is either flat or growing modestly, maybe 10% year over year, right? And that capacity is fairly constrained because they are responsible for thinking about security across domains that they understand fairly well, like endpoint and network, as well as thinking about how to protect their in-house applications that have security requirements that are, somewhat challenging to transfer to a third party. And then as they look to some of the, I'll call them newer domains, as businesses move to the cloud, as an example, domains of identity, email, SaaS, cloud infrastructure, and now AI, there are real gaps today. And I think we can confidently project that those gaps are only going to widen over time as the technologies within these domains become more broadly adopted, and threat actors also start shifting some of their tactics and behaviors over to these domains as well. And you can see the quote from Brett at Microsoft on the right-hand side, that when you combine the speed, scale, and sophistication of the threat landscape with the gap that teams are experiencing, it creates a responsibility for all of us to evolve and improve our approach to address this gap. Just a quick poll question so we can get a snapshot for how people are feeling about their security maturity today. Let us know which domain is creating the biggest gap for you today. I'll just pause here to give folks a chance to put in their responses, and then we'll flash up the results that'll give us some context on where to steer some of the future conversation. Keith, just as we have this up, what do you typically see from customers, prospective customers, as you're talking to them about their challenges and their gaps?
I think in general, I'd say the kind of abstract challenge is, like, as you alluded to before, I think even that list of, kind of technology or security domains that we have to keep our eye on is already, I think, just like a little bit more expansive than most folks are staffed to handle. But on the back end of that, particularly with things like SaaS applications and cloud infrastructure, like that's just proliferating at such a fast pace. And adoption of those technologies is by design. It's very easy, it's very fast, and particular in organizations that don't have kind of strong proactive controls that gate people's ability to just go sign up for a new SaaS application or a new cloud application. That tends to be, I think, the really pressing challenge. That's just like kind of, data access, identity information, just seems to be kind of like it's making its way out the door a little bit faster than folks can keep their hands on and understand. So I think that in general, just like the technology outpacing, and I think that kind of like cloud in general is an interesting one.
Yeah, there you go.
Just seems to be rapidly outpacing our ability to like understand those things at a low level, which is really a prerequisite to being able to keep them safe, right? And so that's one way to think about how that cycle evolves.
What is interesting about these results is that yes, cloud is in the lead, but there's an interesting distribution across the rest, right? There is maybe email is clear in second place, SaaS and identity coming up behind the rear, but problems across the board, or gaps, I should say, across the board. And when we dive into those gaps, the reality is there's quite a bit of work to be done in creating more maturity, enhancing your security posture within each of these domains. Just so to orient you to the matrix we have on display here, there's the NIST cybersecurity framework across the top: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and then the domains on the left-hand side. Credit to the cyber defense matrix for inspiring some of this work. And what's interesting here is that you think about this body of work. There's another set of work that NIST is standardizing some guiding principles around, which is governance, right? And the central theme of a lot of what NIST is about to publish in their 2.0 framework is that you need to find ways to effectively communicate with a broader set of business stakeholders, both internal stakeholders, your external stakeholders like your board, right? And so managing all this complexity and also having time to, digest what's happening and communicate what's happening out to your peers and key stakeholders presents perhaps even more of a challenge. And just a quick poll for folks as well. Let us know what security framework you use to assess your security program's performance or maturity. And we'll come back to this in a second as well, too. Okay. And then Keith, I'll hand it off to you to talk about how we traditionally would have approached, using that cyber defense matrix to think about, where we invest in our security program.
Yeah, for sure. When you particularly, and I'd say the really important part of this type of diagram in general is you can put whatever you want over there on the left, right? You can kind of define those things in any way that's useful. And everyone's kind of desired end state, of course, is that you're good at all of these things, right? Where identify and protect are kind of on that, incident avoidance and, pre-incident or incident preparation phase, and then detect, respond, recover. Obviously, at that point, you've got an incident. And so, for a long time, I think, both internal teams, like enterprise security teams, were staffed and structured to try to perform as many of these functions across as many of these domains as they possibly could. And I'd say on the vendor side, the same thing has been true, right? The decades past of managed security services of all flavors were really optimized for doing a little bit in each of these areas, and enough so that when a customer or security leader looked at this chart, a bunch of things were checked off, and bingo, it feels great when you kind of have a whole, you've got something done end to end. And so that, and in some ways, that, makes folks feel good, gives you confidence. And if, particularly if you've invested in a lot of these areas too, purely from a financial standpoint, if you've invested in technology to protect all of these different domains and your invested time and expertise, you want to know that someone's looking at those things, someone's looking at those alerts, and that you're getting credit for that too. Really, when it comes to compliance, right? If you're SOC ISO certified, if you're scoring yourself against things like FFIEC or DIST. So I'd say that's kind of been the approach for years and years. And thankfully, I think as an industry, we've learned a lot from that and evolved, which is great. And so I think that's what we'd like to talk through today is an approach, and one that we think is worked really well for us and for our customers, to effectively take these lessons that we've learned and I'd say the more specific things that have ended up being a challenge for us, right? Having to try to just do more work, spread your staff a little bit more thin, expand your staff, right, to try to satisfy all those requirements, and to buy more tools, right? When we're kind of looking at that list on the left, again, there's a natural tendency to say, I've got this type of technology in my enterprise and I'm going to buy security tools to keep it safe. And in every way, right, you're kind of spreading, you're spreading the staff you have thin. It's really tough to build expertise. It's tough to master any meaningful number of tools unless you've got a huge team with a ton of focus. And so, those, when you kind of think back to that grid and that desire to say, hey, we've got it covered, these are some of the more specific pitfalls that we've seen, organizations of all sizes kind of fall into over time. So that's what we want to talk about avoiding. And so when we say things like a modern approach to security operations, what we're talking about is learning lessons from those past approaches, right? And figuring out how we're going to, how we can optimize that, things we'd want to do differently, things we might want to prioritize differently. And so one of the things that we'll kind of walk through here is the concept of threat intelligence, which I think everyone here is familiar with, but most importantly, how and where that factors in to a modern and more effective and more focused approach to security operations. So we've got this poll up here. Give everyone just a moment to chime in. We'll come back to this later, just kind of curious where folks source their threat intelligence today. And looking at these are fundamentally these are different types of intelligence from organizations that do different types of work too. So I'd say more so than who you choose to get your intelligence from, I'd say the type of intelligence and the breadth of intelligence that you seek out is an important distinction as well. So here's I'd say the highest level of the pitch is that we want to manage SOCs like you manage a great product, right? And one of the principles of a great product is that you understand your customer, you understand the really, really acute problems that they have. Most great products don't solve a whole bunch of problems. They solve a few really, really important problems really well. And in security operations, our most pressing problems are going to be those high likelihood, high impact threats, right? The things that we know statistically are going to materialize. They're harming our peers. Maybe they've harmed our organizations at times in the past. And then below that, looking at the top attack techniques that those threats leverage, right? And there's, one of the things we've learned over the years is even though these threats evolve over time, how they operate and at kind of a level below, what you call them or what they look like or what they are, the techniques that they leverage to get access to organizations, to move laterally and to get what they want. There's not a ton of drift in those over time, even looking over 4 or 5 years of this data. And so, so that's the going in position in the pitch, right? Is to think about that and to really start by focusing almost obsessively on that relatively small number of things that you think are going to have an outside impact. And so when we talk about managing your security operations team as a product, we look to threat intelligence as our product manager effectively, right? It points us in the right direction, helps us prioritize. It's a decision support tool, right? And so the flow for that, the way that looks in a high functioning security operations team is that you're using that to identify the most prevalent, most impactful threats. And of course, you're applying a lens to that overlays the type of technology that you have, the things that you are critical to being able to operate your business and serve your own customers. And so identifying those threats, establishing visibility first, right? More so than anything else. It's important that you're in a position where you can detect and respond to threats, even if today you don't feel like you're in a place to go build expansive detection coverage and do a lot of really in-depth like threat hunting and investigations. Being in a position to do that when and if you need to is probably like the single most important thing, because that puts you in a position to help like prevent the things that you can, to detect the rest, either internally or getting help from an external partner, and obviously responding when you do have an incident, right? And learning from those incidents, right? That kind of rinse and repeat cycle is critical. Like when you have an incident, responding to that incident, so containing it, recovering, that's a part of the process, but equally important is understanding, how that thing happened in the first place, and understanding how you can keep that type of thing from happening repeatedly, right? So, one of the things that we really hate to see is when you have like the same organizations being impacted by the same types of incidents and the same threats over and over again. It's actually fine to have incidents. Like the more incidents you have, like the more effective your detection and response process is. But what you don't want are a whole bunch of repeat high severity incidents, right? Like you want to be dealing with new hard problems and emerging threats, and that's a signal that this whole thing is kind of working as intended. Anything to add there, Aaron, before I move on?
Yeah, actually, a question back to you, right? So I think this is great when it works. You identify a threat that's prevalent and impactful, and you like pull it all the way through. Curious if you've had any experience, if we at Red Canary have ever had any experience where like there's intel that, I don't know, leads us astray, or, it looks like it could be really interesting to go off and, do deeper research, invest time and energy in. But the reality is it's not a threat that's going to impact the business. So we shouldn't be spending our time and attention there, right? Just trying to kind of draw a contrast to the audience a little bit.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. And I think maybe we'll cover a little bit of that when we kind of talk through, see if like when we look at the types of like intelligence that people consume, right? And actually like this is in general, and I'd say everything we have here up on the screen, I would consider to be like a really high quality source of intelligence. One of the things that you do have to watch out for, and I think this is like less an issue when you're looking at these like big reports that are looking at like a meaningful amount of data over time. It's like the trap I think you're describing is in particular, and it's not always a trap that practitioners fall into. Sometimes it's a trap that like is thrust upon them like by leadership or someone asking questions. But like, we definitely have a tendency to like fetishize things like advanced persistent threats, and like these are very real problems. They're absolutely happening to some organizations, but statistically, like they are exceedingly rare, right? And so, so I'd say that's one of the things to look out for when we say take an intelligence-led approach. A key component of that is just understanding like the level of intelligence that you want to be looking at, or at least the level of intelligence you want to start from. And then kind of working your way down and being really careful not to let threat intelligence, particularly like breaking threat intelligence, like a lot of sensational headlines, like don't let that drive your work, right? It's very, very easy for that to distract you, kind of take your eye off the ball. Like one of the, I mentioned before, we have like, we're looking at threats, right? And a lot of these are things that like, they're the names that you hear if you like read threat intelligence, either like these big reports or if you're reading breaking news, right? Things like Mimikatz, Bootloader, a lot of these adversary groups that target different industries, right? We absolutely work with those and like we track them. They're a super important component when it comes to prioritization. But the reason that they're important is because, again, underlying those threats with like the names that you hear about and read about is a relatively small set of techniques, right? Like the things like the very specific like technical implementations, tools that they employ to get what they want. And so, when you're looking at any threat intelligence, you want to understand who they're targeting. You want to understand the vectors, right? Like how are these things going to show up? It's absolutely important to understand, like, are Are you on the lookout for, vulnerabilities in internet exposed devices? Are you on the lookout for vulnerabilities in things like, your cloud infrastructure and containers? Are you on the lookout for malicious emails? Like, those are critical. The level below that, and like when you're reading any of this reporting, the thing you want to watch out for and really take away are these specific techniques, right? Like, these are the things that you can take inside, you can prioritize, you can understand them, and then you can take action in the form of building like detection capabilities, testing your detection capabilities, and then seeing that through. So I'd say that's a huge, like, that's one way you can take these big reports that have a lot of big names and a lot of things that like sound scary, and sometimes they are, but you can distill those down into like a relatively small set of things that you can make very concrete in action. When you were talking earlier, Aaron, about those things, like having that discussion about falling into the trap, right? Like, APTs as a really good example. If you put those on this chart, they may be very high impact, but for most organizations, they're a very low probability, right? Like, APTs for 99.9% of organizations are bottom left, right? Or like in some cases, they're going to be like top left, right? And that depends on, the type of data that you have, whether you're even like a target of interest. And so like understanding those things and asking those questions is a super useful exercise to figure out like where on the left side of that chart are you when it comes to like these really sophisticated threats. Now, like we always used to joke that like if you make satellites and it stands to reason that like your adversary can also launch satellites, you might be over there, like on the right-hand side, when you're looking at some of those threats that are still relatively low probability, like across the board. It's still more likely that you're going to be impacted by something like ransomware or account compromise or business email compromise. But plotting those things in the context of your own organization, understanding like the industry that you work in, the data that you have, and who wants it. It's a super useful exercise. And we put these few things here top right for a really specific reason, because these are things that when you talk to any organization, no matter what industry you're in, no matter what type of data you have, like these are effectively a baseline threat model for us all, right? They're things that we all need to worry about, and they're all interrelated, right? Like getting a malicious email and letting that slip through the cracks leads to account compromise, which very often leads to ransomware. And so these are also not like, these things aren't entities unto themselves. Like they, all of these things are interconnected, and understanding and prioritizing and protecting yourselves from any one of them has really net positive effects on anything else that you're going to put on this grid. So.
That's awesome.
And anything else to add there you want to cover before we move on?
Just one, and that, as somebody who operated as a product manager for a few years, right, what always made me feel confident in the recommendations that I was making to the business about where we should, invest our time and energy is having that voice of customer. Somebody external to your business could also be somebody internal to your business. And, essentially what you just articulated is taking all that data analytics from threat intelligence and applying it in the domain of, what's impactful to your business is understanding the customer, right? Now, your business is in many ways the customer. And so you have to use that lens, or I shouldn't say you have to, using that lens will actually help you understand what to prioritize and what not to prioritize. So
yeah, absolutely.
Speaks
and one of the things I kind of always value a lot about these frameworks, like the one that we were using earlier, which I know we'll revisit, and this one, is that I think there is absolutely kind of like there is a baseline that we can all kind of gravitate towards and operate around, and that I think is valuable to everyone. But even just sitting down and like workshopping something like this, which you can do on a piece of paper, like a giant flip chart or a whiteboard in relatively little time. Just the discussions that drives and like the questions that it leads you to ask, right? whether you're doing it in-house as like an enterprise, or if you are a service provider, like working with a customer or a partner. Those are like some of the most valuable discussions, right? Because like those things that you surface and those decisions that you make are the things that are going to guide your work probably for years to come. So. And maybe I'll leave, I will leave with this, right? There's been a huge theme here. And the undercurrent of all of this is focus, right? And understanding that, like, particularly when we say like guiding your work for like quarters or months or years to come, had those out of order, but like that's the key, right? That is strategy, is just thinking, hey, like how do we balance what we need to do today? Like how do we balance the threats that like we know are likely to materialize today? And like, how do we balance those with the technology that we know the organization is adopting over the next like 3, 6, 9, 12 months? And that is like, those are hard trade-offs, right? Again, like, we would love to see a grid where like, it's all check boxes, it's all green. We feel really good that we understand all the technology and that we understand how to effectively like protect it across all of those like activities in that incident life cycle. But the reality is that both for an individual company and like even for a service provider, like MDR provider like us, right? Like we all have to make hard trade-offs. And but using that, I think, using that intelligence-led approach, like gives you a fairly objective set of inputs that you can use. And again, like intelligence at the end of the day, really being it's a decision support tool, right? That's the way that it's intended to be used. And so rather than using it as a tool to just like kind of drive like very tactical work day in, day out, like using that as a filter and understanding like which things you might have to wait to do, which things you might have to prioritize differently is critical. So Aaron, I'll turn it over to you, kind of talk through how we think about just taking this intelligence-led approach, bringing it into the SOC, and then this will be a good discussion about trade-offs and like some of those hard decisions that we know we have to make.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. And I feel like you just did a great job of helping people understand how to get to that place where you have a set of prioritized objectives or investments of time, energy, resources, right? And then, also understanding that that framework is up against a set of existing investments, existing focus areas, right? Existing priorities for the individual humans who are going to carry out this work. And so the next level down, right, is thinking about how to sharpen that focus a little bit by really making sure that you are spending your precious time, energy, and resource on the things that are unique to your business, right? And what might sound like something that is unique to your business, right? It might be a task that is strategically important and requires sensitive internal knowledge or sensitive internal or external communication, something that a vendor just simply cannot do, right? It might be something that you are required to do for compliance reasons, right? It may fall in the domain of your in-house applications that just require so much business context that it's actually hard for an external party to jump in and take some of that work off of your plate. And then you think about the opposite of that, things that are worthy candidates for transfer, not necessarily that you have to transfer them, but that you should think about transferring them. Again, knowing that you have a limited pool of resources today, threats that are common or universal. Keith shared that, based on the technology that you are using and the, industry that you are in, there's a baseline threat model that is applicable not just to you, but to a pretty broad set of organizations like you. And therefore, there may be a vendor out there like Red Canary who's already done the work of building out a set of detection analytics and response capabilities against that base universal threat model. We'll talk more about that here in a second. Another thing to think about as something that's viable for transfer, right, are things that can be automated. We are in the age of AI and automation. Tread lightly here, but obviously finding time to optimize humans by augmenting them with automation is a worthy exercise. And then for many organizations, specifically in these emerging domains of cloud security, actually having the expertise, understanding how to implement controls and respond to alerts across maybe not just one cloud environment, but maybe you have two or maybe three cloud, infrastructure tools that you use, Amazon, Azure, and GCP. A human or set of humans that can navigate all three control planes is actually difficult for most organizations to bring in-house. So that might be another area where you think about augmenting your existing team and your existing skill sets to get you to a place where you have a better security posture in days and weeks instead of years. And just to back this up a little bit, here's a Gartner strategic planning assumption that by 2025, by the way, that's next year, we're in 2024 right now, 90% of the global 2000 will outsource at least 50% of their security operations workload, right? That's pretty darn significant. And by the way, the trend line on this, if you looked at the planning assumption maybe 5 years ago, is up and to the right. It used to be around 60, 65%. So more outsourcing is happening. Why? Because environments are getting more and more complex and resources are becoming harder and harder to acquire. And so this is only natural that you need to start thinking about a more hybrid model, meaning you do some of the work yourself and you outsource things that make sense to third parties, right? And Keith and I came up with this, we'll call it a simple framework, right? To think about, again, what's a viable transfer candidate? Again, mapping to this notion of there being a base threat model for a lot of the security domains that most organizations have some exposure to today, right? And so in the blue, what we have done is we've color coded what we think might be viable for transfer. And then the, call it green, is what almost has to be done in-house. Your in-house applications, you need capacity to secure those and protect those in-house. And recovery, business resiliency. Yes, there are tools you can bring in for like immutable backups, but the actual process of getting the business back on its feet, again, is something that is often best managed by internal resources. And Keith, welcome your commentary on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, like all these, again, like these are, it's intended to be illustrative, but that, that kind of, it's a good going in position, right? That you can take those core technology domains, and in particular, a lot of the security operations side is really in detect and respond, right? For us, like that's our number one priority, is to help lock that down. And a lot of what you get in identify and protect just comes by virtue of like the tech, the security stack that you have in place, right? And so, even when it says in-house and co-manage, right? Like that's not even one size fits all. Like some of that stuff in blue is handled like almost like largely by technology, and like those preventative controls you put in place, things like that, like really strong device protection, identity protection, cloud posture management. Detect and respond really are very much at the heart of just like day-to-day security operations. And as Aaron alluded to, like there's the periphery there. And of course there's stuff that, like cuts right through the middle that you really have to do, right? Like I'd say, thinking back to the chart we had up before, it's, I'd say like, really putting the screws to like what you think is like exceptionally valuable to you and what's transferable, right? Like DLP is always like a fascinating kind of case study to pick up here, because that's one that's uniquely challenging, right? Most of that data like lives inside of SaaS apps that you're gating through identity, protection or IAM products. But that's a really good example of, even though it falls inside of the blue there, like a lot of those decisions about whether someone's like using data in a way that they're authorized, things like that, like still tend to be uniquely internal decisions when you once you get into an investigation. And so starting with something like this, which is mostly useful for starting arguments, and then, but like really like thoughtfully refining it till you get to the point that you have some consensus internally and with your partners on, the things that you feel like, the flags you really have to carry, and then where like areas where you can get help and gain a lot of leverage.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. So we've got about 10 minutes left of your time. And again, thank you for joining us today. Encourage you all to start thinking about the questions that you have for Keith or myself as it relates to these frameworks, or really anything. I'm going to spend the next just couple of minutes for those of you who aren't familiar with Red Canary, just talking about, again, our capabilities relative to some of these frameworks that we just described, and then we'll jump right into your questions. And Keith, if you see a relative or a related question pop up, feel free to interject. But Red Canary, we're really here to augment your team and boost your security program and security team's effectiveness. And the reason why we believe that we're built to enable intelligent-led security operations is because that's how we have built and managed Red Canary as an offering to the market for the past 10 years, right? So we have truly adopted and hardened this approach over our time, working with literally thousands of organizations of all shapes and sizes. And how it comes together, right, is we offer a security operations platform. We are known for our managed detection and response capabilities, but we also offer services like readiness, as an example, to get you prepared for threats that are likely to occur within your business. And then alongside that, we partner with you, and by we, I mean our elite security experts, many of whom are tier 3, tier 4 analysts, really work side by side with your team. They're available, they're a phone call away to help you work through not just, a threat that shows up at your door, but also how to think about optimizing your security program to be more effective and efficient across a lot of the domains that we just discussed, right? And how to think about the value more specifically to perhaps some of the things you're seeing in your security program today. One of the things our customers tell us about all the time is our ability to triage alerts for them, using both our security operations platform, which does some of this automatically, and then also the humans that we put in the loop to really reduce the number of false positives that your team has to go off and inspect and explore, right? We also deeply connect to a number of systems in your stack to find threats that other security tools may miss. And that's because we're looking at the behaviors. We're looking for the behaviors, right? Going beyond just the alert and trying to understand how threat actors are actually moving around your organization, and making sure that when we see something, we say something, right? That you're alerted to that suspicious activity. And the way that you experience this is we show you all of the data and all of the context behind the data in a unified timeline. And our experts walk through those timelines with our customers to make sure they are prepared to respond again quickly and effectively and efficiently. And then when you think about the domains, right, we offer protection across cloud, user, and endpoint. And you can see some of the domains that we discussed reflected here on this slide as well. And we have taken our intelligence-led approach, threat-driven approach, and really optimized our platform for some of the most pervasive threats in these domains, knowing that they change over time, right? But as Keith mentioned, there is a lot of stability in some of the most common threats, and more importantly, the tactics, the TTPs underneath these threats. And Keith, welcome again your commentary here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. That I don't think you did a good job of covering it. I do think maybe the most important thing to consider here, and I'd say this is like the burden that our like operations and engineering and like product team manages day in, day out, is the fact that even you've kind of got cloud, user, and endpoints, but from our perspective, we can rewind a little bit to that discussion we had about, understanding what those threats look like and understanding where you need to be to kind of like meet those adversaries where they are, right? To observe their activity in the first place, and then to be able to detect and respond. And I'd say a huge part of the value that I get, even just, like consuming the internal intelligence and looking at the things that our team finds day in, day out, but also understanding like the data sources that we're kind of constantly having to chase and look at, is that even in any one of these domains, if you just picked cloud, right? We did a super fun, research exercise just looking at all of the Amazon Web Services, like the AWS data sources that are available, and figuring out, of the 50 or 60 of them that exist, what are the most critical ones for us to be looking at day in, day out to give us confidence that we can protect those environments, while still constantly like reevaluating the rest and trying to figure out how to balance that. And that same thing's happening like in user and in endpoints. And so I'd say that's for me, it's like a huge point of value from an intelligence and just an educational standpoint. And I think for customers too, you kind of talk about that delivery gap, right? Like a massive amount of that is just kind of managing that nonstop current of like technology change and data that you have to understand and understand how to value and operationalize. So it's a ton of fun to watch this work. It is a ton of work, but I think just like I love the simplification here, and just but understanding that you're reevaluating what those threats look like and like how that technology is manifesting in your environment on a pretty constant basis. And so like it's an area where we hope we can provide folks with a ton of leverage.
Yeah, and if you have questions, again, encourage you to reach out to the team. And I'll leave you with this, right? And I mentioned that we work with organizations of any shape and size across industries, and you can see some of the value that they articulate back to us, right? The ability to get 24/7 coverage without taxing their existing team or bringing on additional headcount for DuPont, or the hospital who was able to stay focused on their mission, right, which is serving their customers within their hospital, as opposed to having to chase down the information required to respond effectively to a breach, right? And that is our one shared goal. That when I say shared, the goal that we share with you. We know you don't want to get breached, and that is our the goal that we work very intensely and intentionally with you on as well. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Here's again a few quick resources for you. The website, feel free to request a demo, a personalized demo if you're looking for more information. And then Adam has provided some resources in the resource section as well. So we will go with Chase's question first. Keith, he says, what do you recommend for quantifying and telling the story to leadership about risks from threats and gaps facing a company?
I was just the last one to pop in is usually the first one to get answered. You timed it well. That's an awesome question. I'd say there's absolutely a storytelling component of it. I think one of the things that we have working on our side as well is also just like being able to take a very kind of facts and data driven approach to that. So one of the things that I know that like Red Canary's CISO, right, who's responsible for protecting our customers by protecting the Red Canary workforce and platform, and like one of the things that we talk about all the time with him is just understanding like looking at our attack surface, looking at our kind of threat model, and then the types of threats that we think are most likely to manifest in our own environment, and just starting with the cost, very frankly, right? And like sometimes that's a dollar cost. It's obviously a huge component of it. IBM puts out a great like cost of data breach report every year. I think the new one just came out. Coalition and some of the other kind of like insurance and insurtech providers also do a really good job, as do like Scientia and the DBIR, places like that. Like just helping to understand like if we have an incident of this type, what is the median cost? And I would kind of always start there. Because frankly, that's going to let you make a really simple value decision to say, hey, if the cost of this incident is $5 to $10 million, and the cost to buy these 2 or 3 things that reduce the likelihood of it significantly, if those things cost a couple $100,000, right there, you've got a really strong just business case and value proposition. But I'd say the flip side of that too, and maybe this is, to the storytelling component of this, is understanding the cost to your reputation, right? And the likelihood, and this obviously depends heavily on like the type of work you do, the type of data you have, who your customers are, and what types of things they entrust you with. But depending on the industry, that can be a huge component. And there's plenty of industries where reputational cost is a far more existential threat than the financial cost on its own, right? So like we work with plenty of just huge financial institutions. They can bear the financial cost of almost any like threat that materializes in their environment, right? But the reputational cost to them is an existential threat to their business, right? That's the thing that will cause them like long-term harm. So I'd say balancing those two, just trying to understand like the cost of those most likely types of incidents, and then the reputational or some of those soft costs that are equally material. It's just trying to couple those things together.
The only other thing I'd add to that, Keith, that has come up in a few of my conversations is the ability to attract and retain really high caliber security talent, right? And like that stems from what types of problems they are going to be focused on solving, right? So it shows up in the job description, as an example. It shows up in how people talk about you on Glassdoor or whatever, wherever those types of kind of peer-to-peer conversations may be happening. And, we talked about burnout among security teams being, a real thing that's been growing, quite a bit over the last couple of years, as is the case with industries. So just something to keep in mind there as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Absolutely. That's a huge component of it. Just it's definitely easy to overlook the likelihood that you can just kind of maintain staffing, year over year, and kind of like that level of organizational intensity that's required. Got one that popped in here. We've got more than we'll get to, but I do want to address there's a question about the threat landscape, and so what's your insight on the most quickly growing threat out there? Will it still be identity and cloud? I'd say the one, and Aaron, like curious, your take on this. We both kind of look at this through different lenses, but from my perspective, I think the prevailing trend in just like business technology in general is that we're pinning identity and access management increasingly into like a relatively small number of platforms, right? So like your cloud-based IDP or your directory service. And in addition to that, I'd say like we're pinning a lot of that trust like into the browser, places like that, right? And so, both of those things kind of converging. I'd say the one that's like seems by far the most concerning and impactful are going to continue to be identity-based threats, right? Like if you're an adversary, there's a whole bunch of ways you can get what you want, right? But like the most reliable way to get access to an organization is to become someone with access to the organization. And so like we, hear about scattered spider and things like that. Those types of attacks, like, they can happen and materialize extremely quickly, right? I do think we're doing a better job overall of like continuing to aggressively protect identity, in particular like end user identity. But when one of those things slip through the cracks and they're compromised, like you're inside of an environment now where that adversary, immediately has access to like a really wide swath of technologies and platforms and data. And so like the breakout time once an identity attack is successful is almost as fast as they can, click through, automate, et cetera, right? And so we have to continue chasing these things across like device security and endpoints and cloud, but all of those things are increasingly pinned to like an underlying identity layer, and like we've got to do a really, really good job of that. So hopefully that's helpful context.
Yeah, I'm with you. And the one thing that resonates for me in that whole storyline is that there's a human in the loop on the identity side of the house, and there's a reason why phishing attacks continue to be very popular. It's because they take advantage of the human in the loop, and so also helps build a case for better understanding the anomalous behaviors that we need to be looking for within an org, knowing that there may be a human in there that's doing something risky, but that's just part of their job description, as opposed to a threat actor doing the same thing. So it starts to shift your perspective a little bit on how you're thinking about security controls and in the brave new world, so to speak. So. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody so much for your time. Really appreciate you sticking with us for the last 50 minutes. Keith, thanks for your great insight and wisdom. Appreciate it as always. And we look forward to seeing everybody on the next Red Canary webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. Thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate it.